The light came around every 40 seconds. Cale Marin had counted it so many times in his first year on Ustra 5 that the number lived in his body now, lodged somewhere between his heartbeat and the memory of breathing. 40 seconds. The lighthouse at Station Corval sat on a basalt ridge above the colony, and its beam swept the settlement in a slow, patient circle, drawing a line through the dark that touched every roof and wall and face before moving on. It had been built in the colony's second year to guide ships down through the interference clouds, back when there were ships to guide. Now it just turned. Now it just reminded people that someone had once cared enough to build something permanent. He was standing on the ridge when the Sci-Fi vessel came down. It didn't land so much as arrive. One moment there was the violet pre-dawn sky, Ustra's two moons setting in opposite directions the way they always did, their reflections fracturing across the methane flats below, and then the vessel was simply there. A wedge of black glass the size of a maritime destroyer, impossibly quiet, hovering at 200 meters before it descended in a column of compressed air that bent the scrubgrass flat in a perfect circle. Cale watched it the way he watched most things these days, with his hands still, his jaw loose, his eyes taking in everything without reacting to any of it. He was 43 years old. He had been on Ustra 5 for 11 of those years. He had buried 22 people in that time, built a greenhouse with his own hands, learned to speak 3 of the planet's 12 wind dialects well enough to navigate by them, and carried a knife on his left hip that had a handle wrapped in dried banana tree sap. A trick his father had taught him in Madeira before any of this, before the colony ships and the transit corridors and the long dreaming silence of interstellar travel. The sap hardened around the carved wood like amber, locking in whatever pattern you'd cut before it set. His handle showed a lighthouse, a circle, a line of text too small to read unless you held it close. He held it now, his thumb tracing the indentations, while the Sci-Fi ship's boarding ramp extended toward the colony's central plaza. Behind him, he heard Commandant Reza Holt's boots on the basalt path. Holt was 6 years younger than Cale and managed to seem both older and younger at the same time, which was a quality Cale associated with administrators everywhere. She came to stand beside him, wrapped in a colony thermal coat, her gray hair braided back with the kind of severity that suggested she hadn't slept. "They're early," she said. "By 11 hours. That's intentional. Everything they do is intentional." Holt exhaled slowly through her nose, watching the ship. "The diplomatic brief says the princess leads the cultural assessment team. She's 19 by their calendar. That's roughly 32 standard years, but their development cycle is different. She's considered young. Very young by their own people's standards. Junior members of the Sci-Fi delegation are almost always assigned the frontier posts." She paused. "It's not exactly a compliment." Cale said nothing. He turned the knife in his hand once, blade down, and slid it back into the sheath. "I need you in the welcoming assembly," Holt said. "The Sci-Fi asked for senior colony members specifically. They've read our files. They asked for you by name." He turned to look at her then. "I know," she said. "I don't know what they want from you specifically, but they know about Vila's crossing. They know about what happened at Station 9. What happened at Station 9 is in a sealed record." "Sealed from us?" "Not from them." She touched his arm briefly, the way a tired person touches something solid to remind themselves of the ground. "Just be there. You don't have to speak. Just be present." He nodded and followed her down the path. The colony of Ustra 5 4th Settlement, called Marin's Reach by almost everyone though the official designation was simply Q4, had been built over 7 years by 412 people who had volunteered for what the Transit Authority called a cultural bridging post. In plain language, it was a listening station, a place humans had built at the edge of Sci-Fi space not to fight and not quite to trade, but to exist in a way that was visible, consistent, and durable. The theory was that the Sci-Fi, who had watched humanity expand for a century, with the particular cold interest of a naturalist studying a new species, might eventually initiate contact if there was something worth contacting. The theory had proven correct, eventually, but not in the way the transit authority had imagined. The Sothii had not come to Marin's Reach to establish diplomatic channels. They had come, as their own communiques eventually made clear, because they wanted to understand why humans kept building things in places where there was no rational reason to build them. They had detected the lighthouse at Corval Station 3 years ago. Its signal had no navigational utility by Sothii analysis. The beam served no tactical purpose. The structure itself was over-engineered by a factor of approximately 12 relative to any conceivable functional requirement. The Sothii, whose culture was built on the absolute alignment of form and function, had found this not threatening but deeply incomprehensible. And incomprehensibility was, among the Sothii, the only true emergency. Cale had been told all of this in a briefing 4 months ago. He had also been told, in a separate briefing that came with a security classification, and a strong recommendation that he not discuss it with the other colonists, that the Sothii delegation's cultural assessment would determine whether Marin's Reach was classified as a persistent settlement, or as what their diplomatic language called a passage structure, a thing that could be dismantled, absorbed, or simply ended without meaningful ceremony. This was, in plain language, a judgment about whether the colony would continue to exist. Cale did not tell the other colonists. He did what he always did. He got up in the morning, worked his section of the greenhouse, took his rotation at the water reclamation plant, and in the evenings read the archive of letters he had brought with him from Earth. His father's letters, his grandmother's letters. Old correspondence between Madeira and Mozambique. A history of people displaced across great distances writing to each other across the dark, keeping themselves real for each other on paper, pressing their personalities into words like a blade pressed into wood. He didn't know why he'd brought them. He'd had almost no personal weight allowance on the colony ship, and he'd used most of it on seeds and hand tools. But the letters had come too, a small sheaf of them in a waterproof sleeve, and on many nights since he'd been glad. The Sothii welcoming assembly took place in the colony's main concourse, which was the largest enclosed space they had. A long, vaulted hall built from the local stone and roofed, with a membrane of transparent polymer that let in the amber light of Ustra's early morning. The colonists had arranged themselves without being told, the way people who have lived in a small community for years arrange themselves by unspoken consensus. The youngest workers at the back, the senior members at the front, everyone clean and upright and quietly terrified. Cale stood at the left end of the front row. Holt was at the center. Between them were Dr. Vera Osei, the colony's head physician, Marcus Ten, who ran the agricultural division, and old Pietras, who had been part of the colony's original survey team and was now 81 years old and moved slowly but stood very straight. The Sothii came in without announcement. There were 11 of them, moving in the loose, flowing formation that Cale had read about in the briefings. The Sothii were tall. The shortest among this group was perhaps 2 meters, with a bilaterally asymmetric body plan that always struck humans as slightly wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. They had 2 primary limbs that functioned as arms and 2 that served as legs, but the proportions weren't quite human. The joints didn't bend in quite the expected directions, and they had secondary manipulators at the base of their torso that they used for fine work, and that they kept folded against their bodies in social settings like 2 extra hands tucked in pockets. Their faces were wide and low, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal row, and their skin had the dark, slightly iridescent quality of deep ocean organisms adapted to low light. They wore garments of woven material that seemed to shift color slowly as they moved. The one at the center front was the princess. Cale recognized her from the briefing photographs, though photographs hadn't done justice to the sheer confidence with which she moved. Valeth. Her full designation was several syllables long and included tonal components that human vocal anatomy couldn't reproduce. But the briefing documents had used Valeth. Walked the way very young members of very old powerful families walked everywhere in the universe, which was to say she walked as though the ground was doing her a favor by being there. She was slender by Sci-Fi standards, with the iridescent markings at her collar and wrists that indicated her bloodline, and her 4 eyes moved across the assembled colonists with an expression that might, in a human face, have read as mild curiosity. In a Sci-Fi face, Kale didn't yet know how to read it. He'd been told the eye movements were significant. He'd been told the angle of the secondary manipulators could indicate status assertions. He hadn't been given enough information to decode any of it in real time. She stopped in front of the colonists and spoke. Her voice had the deep, resonant layering of Sci-Fi speech, 2 or 3 tones operating simultaneously in a kind of chord, and the translation device at Commandant Holt's waist processed it after a 2-second delay. "We have reviewed your colony's history and existing infrastructure," the translation said, in flat, synthesized English. "We have noted several structural and behavioral anomalies which our cultural assessment team will document during our visit. Our findings will be transmitted to the Deliberative Council within 40 days. We expect your full cooperation and transparency during our assessment period. We will not be confined to scheduled interactions. Our team will move freely through your settlement at any time and document what we observe." There was a pause. Then Valeth added something that the translation rendered as, "We have also noted that your settlement's human population has maintained continuous presence for 11 years without significant structural failure. This is longer than predicted by initial models. We are here in part to understand why." Holt responded with the prepared diplomatic greeting. Kale watched Valeth's eyes during it. The princess wasn't looking at Holt. She was looking at the assembly itself, moving from face to face in the systematic way of someone cataloging, and when her gaze reached Kale, it stopped. She held on him for perhaps 5 seconds longer than she'd held on anyone else. Then she moved on. The first 3 days of the Sci-Fi visit were careful and strange in the way of things held carefully. The assessment team dispersed through the colony with their documentation equipment, which looked like nothing so much as very elaborate version of hands, and recorded everything. The greenhouse rows, the water systems, the maintenance schedules, the sleeping arrangements, the communal meal times, the way children did their lessons in the colony school, the way old Pietras shuffled to his morning station at the meteorological post and sat there for exactly 2 hours every day reading the weather instruments and making notes in a paper journal that he had been keeping since day 1. They asked questions through their translators in the flat, affectless way of people who have decided that tone is an inefficiency. They filmed the lighthouse. They filmed the lighthouse for a long time. Kale watched them film it from across the plaza on the second day, standing with a cup of grain tea that had gone cold in his hand. 2 of the Sci-Fi assessors circled the structure with their equipment extended, documenting every angle, and he could see them communicating with each other in the rapid, subvocal way of Sci-Fi, which looked to human observers like nothing was happening and apparently constituted entire conversations. One of them reached out and touched the lighthouse base with what Kale now recognized as a secondary manipulator. A careful, deliberate touch, curious maybe, or measuring something. Valeth herself spent the first 2 days in the administrative section, reviewing colony records with Holt and a team of human liaison staff. Kale heard reports from the liaison staff each evening. The princess asked questions with the precision of someone who had memorized the answers before asking them and was checking whether the humans would lie. She was particularly interested in the colony's resource allocation data, specifically in resources devoted to what she called non-survival cultural objects. She asked this more than once, in different framings. Why does your colony dedicate 7% of total material resources to objects and practices with no measurable survival function? Why do you maintain structures that serve no operational purpose when the resources could support additional food production? Why do your people spend time on activities that produce no quantifiable output? Holt answered carefully, the way a diplomat answers, threading between what is true and what is comprehensible to the person asking. Cale, when these reports came back to him, thought about his knife, about his grandmother's letters, about the lighthouse drawing its circle every 40 seconds in the dark. On the third day, Valeth came to the memorial. It was in the eastern quarter of the colony, set against the basalt wall that formed Marin's Reach's natural eastern boundary. It was not an official structure in any transit authority record. It had been built by the colonists themselves, slowly, over years, as a way of marking the people they had lost. It was a long, low wall of the local dark stone, and into it the colonists had carved names and dates, and in many cases, small images. Whatever the dead person had loved or built or said that was worth keeping. Near the center was a carving that one of the greenhouse workers, a woman named Dora Essian who had died in the 4th year from a pressure suit failure, had made herself before she died. A banana tree, rendered in careful lines, its fronds curving outward from the trunk, sap depicted as a flowing line that ran down into the base of the carving where it became, if you looked closely, the outline of a coastline. The island of Sao Tome, where she'd grown up. She had carved it with a tool improvised from a colonist maintenance kit, pressing her history into the stone of an alien world, insisting on it. Cale was there when Valeth arrived because he went to the memorial every morning. He didn't speak to it or perform any ritual. He just stood there for a few minutes and looked at the names. It was a thing he did the way breathing was a thing he did. Valeth arrived with 2 assessors and her primary translator, a human liaison named Fenn who had been assigned from the diplomatic corps, and had the careful, slightly stunned expression of someone who had been doing this job for a year and had not yet gotten used to it. The princess moved along the memorial wall with the systematic observation she brought to everything, her assessors recording. Cale stayed where he was, to one side, watching without appearing to watch. He saw the moment she reached Dora's carving because she stopped, her 4 eyes fixed on the banana tree image, then moved across the details, the sap line, the coastline at the base. She said something to Fenn. She wants to know, Fenn said, his voice carefully neutral, what the functional purpose of this structure is. Cale said, it's a memorial. We put the names of people who died here, and things they made or loved. Fenn translated. Valeth responded. She says, the individuals recorded here no longer exist in any operational sense. Maintaining records of non-operational entities consumes resources that could be redirected. She asks whether this structure has a practical function you haven't described. Cale thought about how to answer that. He had been thinking about how to answer that kind of question for 11 years in various forms. He said, it reminds us of who we are. Fenn translated. There was a longer exchange than usual. One of the assessors interjected something. Valeth listened, then spoke again. She says, you know who you are through biological and cognitive continuity. You do not require external reminders. She says this structure is, by her analysis, a display of weakness, evidence that your population requires artificial supports for self-concept that a more developed civilization would have internalized. She says she will include this in the assessment, as it speaks to the foundational dependency structures of your colony culture. Cale was quiet for a moment, not because he was choosing words carefully. He was watching Valeth's secondary manipulators, which had extended slightly toward the carved wall. Then, with the same deliberate curiosity with which her assessors had touched the lighthouse, she reached out with one hand, her primary right hand, which in Sci-Fi body language, Cale knew from his briefings, was a gesture of ownership assertion, of a superior entity placing a marker on an object it has evaluated and found unremarkable, and she pressed her palm flat against Dora Essian's carved banana tree. Not violently, gently even, but thoroughly, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never encountered an objection they were required to take seriously. She held it there for a count of 3. Then she withdrew her hand and turned to speak to her assessors. Cale stood very still. Around him the morning was quiet. The lighthouse was turning on the ridge, its beam not yet visible in the amber daylight but turning regardless, 40 seconds, 40 seconds, the circle patient and indifferent and permanent. He looked at the wall. Dora's carving was still there, untouched, unchanged. Nothing had been damaged. The gesture had been, by any measurable standard, nothing. He looked at Valeth, who was already half turned away from the memorial, speaking to her assessors in the rapid, subvocal stream of Sci-Fi conversation, as though the interaction were concluded and filed. He picked up his thermos of cold tea, he turned, he walked away. He did not say anything. He did not look back. He did not change his pace. He simply walked in the direction of the greenhouse, the same direction he would have walked at this time on any morning, and he disappeared around the basalt corner. He heard Fen say in a slightly confused voice something about, but he was already past hearing it. Fen found him in greenhouse section 3 an hour later, where Cale was checking the moisture monitors on the row of root vegetables that fed roughly a third of the colony's caloric intake. Fen stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, which suggested he either wasn't sure he was welcome or wasn't sure what he was walking into. Cale looked up, closed the door. Temperature. Fen closed the door. He stood with his hands at his sides in the particular posture of a man who had been told to deliver a message and was doing the math on it before he opened his mouth. "Princess Valeth would like to know," he said, "why you left without acknowledgement." Cale returned his attention to the moisture monitors. "I was finished." Fen paused. "She's asking our liaison staff to explain what that means, in context." "It means I didn't have anything more to say." "She's interpreting it as a withdrawal action, a deliberate signal." "It's a deliberate signal," Cale agreed. Fen was quiet for a moment. He was young, maybe 30, with the careful, over-controlled manner of someone trained in diplomatic restraint who was finding the training tested. "She said, and I'm translating precisely, that your departure was discourteous, that senior colony members are expected to remain present during formal assessment interactions." Cale set down his monitoring tool. He looked at Fen. "Was it a formal assessment interaction?" "She considers." "Was it announced as one? Was I given a schedule? Was I informed that my presence was required at the memorial at that specific time?" He kept his voice level, not angry, just accurate. "I was standing at our memorial because that's what I do in the morning. She came to the memorial. That doesn't make my presence obligatory." Fen absorbed this. "She considers your departure to be a statement." "It is a statement." "She wants to know what statement." Cale was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the vegetable rows. He looked at his hands, which were still and brown and covered in the fine soil of Ustra 5 in the way of hands that had worked this particular ground for years. "Tell her," he said finally, "that I don't have any words for her right now." Fen blinked. "That's she'll want clarification." "The Sci-Fi don't really." "I know they don't. Tell her anyway." Fen left with the careful urgency of someone who suspects he is carrying a live thing but doesn't want to shake it. The rest of that morning was interesting in the way that mornings are interesting when a stone has been dropped into still water, and the rings are still moving outward. Cale went back to the greenhouse. He worked. He found, when he focused on the task in front of him, the moisture monitors, the soil samples, the tracking of root temperatures against the ambient shift that happened every third day on Ustra when the planet's axial tilt put the colony briefly in a shallower angle to the sun. that the morning's encounter receded to a manageable distance. This was a skill he had developed consciously over 11 years and unconsciously over the 43 before them. The ability to let the current thing be the current thing, fully, without the unfinished thing crowding in. The greenhouse was the greenhouse. The roots were the roots. The day's work was the day's work. Marcus 10 came through at mid-morning with a seed inventory clipboard and an expression that said he'd heard something and was deciding whether to ask. "Heard you walked out on the princess," he said after a while. Cale checked a moisture reading. "I left." "That's what I said." "It's different." Marcus wrote something on the clipboard. He was a large, deliberate man who had grown up farming on the coast of what used to be the Netherlands, and who approached most things with the methodical patience of someone who had watched weather enough years to stop being surprised by it. He and Cale had built Section 3 of the greenhouse together in year 2, working for 6 weeks in the cold to get the frame sealed before the first winter storm. "Holt's concerned," he said. "I know. She's not wrong to be. I know that too." Marcus filed the clipboard under his arm. "You know what I keep thinking about? First winter. The compressor on Section 2 failed, and we had about 12 hours to figure out how to keep the temperature regulated manually, or we were going to lose 6 months of growth. And you went in there at about 2 in the morning with that toolkit your father gave you, and you didn't come out for 7 hours, and when you did, you'd fixed it with components that weren't supposed to work together, and you hadn't said a word the whole time to any of us standing outside waiting." Cale did not say anything. "I'm not saying it's the same thing," Marcus said. "I'm just saying that when you go quiet, it's usually because you're working on something." He left. Cale looked at the moisture readings for a while without seeing them. He thought about what Marcus had said. He thought about whether he was working on something. He thought about the princess's hand on the memorial, that unhurried gesture, not aggressive, not cruel in any way that could be argued, simply the gesture of a person for whom the weight of other people's grief did not register as weight at all. Not because she was evil, because she was young and powerful, and had never been required to know the weight because nothing in her life had ever required her to carry anything. He thought, "She is not my enemy." He thought, "She is something more difficult than an enemy." He thought, "She is a person who is going to decide, in 40 days, whether this place survives, and she does not yet have the framework to understand what she would be ending." And then he thought, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have spent time in silence on matters that resist resolution, "My job is not to argue for our survival. My job is not to persuade her or defeat her or perform the correct cultural ritual of petition. My job is to exist here, correctly, in the way that says what cannot be said." He had walked away. Now he would see what that meant. Fenn came back in the early afternoon. He found Cale at the basalt workbench outside Section 3, sharpening a soil tool with the flat stone method that worked better on Ustra than anything mechanical, the rhythm of it slow and even. "She's called off the afternoon assessment session," Fenn said. "First time since they arrived." Cale worked the stone along the blade. "The assessors are being unusually quiet," Fenn said. "I don't know what that means in Sci-Fi terms. They're not documenting anything. They're just present, in their quarters mostly. One of them came to look at the lighthouse again, alone, without recording equipment." "What did he do?" She stood there for a while." Fenn paused. "She touched it, just put her hand on it, then left." Cale set down the sharpening stone and checked the tool's edge. "The princess has been going through the colony's digital archive," Fenn said. "The records that Holt made available to them, the colony histories, the personal diaries that people contributed. She asked specifically for entries marked with the keyword home." He was quiet for a moment. "There are 412 colonists." The search returned 863 separate entries. Cale looked up at that. "People use the word a lot," Fenn said quietly. Cale looked back at the tool. Yeah, he said, they do. He thought about the way the colonists used the word in those diaries, which he had read some of over the years. Not snooping, they were shared, contributed willingly to the colony's communal record. The way the letters between Madeira and Mozambique had been kept and eventually passed down. They used the word home to mean the place they'd come from, and they used it to mean Marin's Reach, sometimes in the same entry, sometimes in the same sentence. The word doing two kinds of work at once, pointing in two directions, like the lighthouse beam at Corval that swept the settlement and then went on into the dark beyond it, illuminating both. He thought about whether that duality made the word weaker or stronger. He thought it made it stronger. He thought that a word that could point in two directions at once was doing something a single pointing word couldn't do, holding two truths simultaneously, refusing to choose between them, insisting that both were real. That was not, he thought, a sign of confusion. That was a sign of a species that had learned to carry contradictions without being destroyed by them, which was perhaps the most useful thing human beings had ever learned to do. He went inside. He made fresh tea and let it go cold. He read the colony weather report for the next cycle. He did not go to find out what was happening in the administrative wing. The colony's evening meal was a communal affair 5 nights a week, held in the main concourse, and that night it had the particular quality of a meal eaten over something unspoken. News traveled fast in a settlement of 400 people, and the content of the morning's encounter at the memorial had traveled faster than usual. The colonists ate and talked as they always did, but there was a watchfulness to it, a tune-frequency attention that made the normal conversation louder in a way that had nothing to do with volume. The Sci-Fi assessment team ate separately, as they always did, in the quarters that had been prepared for them in the administrative wing. Cale ate with old Pietras, who was the only person in the colony he could sit with without having to narrate anything. Pietras had a way of chewing his food in silence that was deeply companionable. He was originally from Gdansk, and he had come to the colony in its first year at the age of 70, which everyone had thought was madness, and he had remained because the work suited him and because, as he said occasionally, he had already been a foreigner in every country he'd ever lived in, so this was merely the logical extension. The princess, Pietras said after a while, is very young. So I'm told. Young people from powerful families are very often certain. He used a piece of bread to chase the remaining sauce on his plate. It is not their fault. They were formed by people who were also certain, and those people were formed by other certain people, and at some point, very far back, there was probably someone who was uncertain, who felt the ground shifting beneath them, who learned to hold onto something. But that person is invisible by now. What remains is only the certainty. Cale drank his water. What did you feel? Pietras asked. When she put her hand on the carving. Yes. Cale thought about it honestly. Nothing I could say. The old man nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected, the answer he would have given himself. That is sometimes the most important thing, the thing that has no words yet. It exists before the words and after them, and the words are just a temporary shelter. He ate the bread. The lighthouse turned on the ridge, 40 seconds. That night in his quarters, Cale opened the waterproof sleeve and took out the letters. They were fragile in the way of paper things kept for a very long time, the edges brown, the folds soft and permanent, the ink in some places faded to a color between gray and nothing. He handled them the way his father had taught him, by the edges, gently, as though paper could feel the difference between careful hands and careless ones. They were letters between his grandmother, Anna Marin, and her sister Philomena, who had moved from Madeira to Mozambique in 1967 with her husband, a man who worked for the shipping administration. They had written to each other for 19 years, from 1967 to 1986, until the correspondence stopped for reasons that Cale had never fully determined. The letters on both sides, he had them both, inherited through his father's careful archiving, were full of the ordinary materials of distant lives. The price of fish, the quality of the rainy season, the behavior of children, the small architectural details of new houses, the plants that grew well and the ones that didn't. Philomena had once written an entire paragraph about a banana tree in her yard in Mozambique, its sap and the particular way it hardened on the knife she used for the garden, and had described carving a figure into the handle, a lighthouse that she said reminded her of home. She had enclosed a small sketch of it, precise and careful, the lighthouse at Ponta do Pargo, which was the lighthouse Cale had thought of when he built the one on Corval Ridge, though he hadn't consciously known that at the time. He had not known about the letter when he built the lighthouse. He had found it after, going through the archive one sleepless night in year 4, and had sat very still for a long time with the letter in his hands, feeling something he had no words for then and had no words for now. He read the letter slowly. He read the one about the banana tree. He read the one where his grandmother wrote back in careful, wounded language about missing Philomena with a specificity that was precise as carving. I miss the sound of your voice when you are trying not to laugh, which is different from when you are genuinely laughing. And I know the difference across 1,000 miles, and I am writing this in the afternoon sun, and I can hear it, and I am putting it here so it exists somewhere beyond my own head. He folded the letters carefully and returned them to the sleeve. Then he sat in the dark for a while and thought about what a 19-year-old princess of a civilization that had never needed to miss anything in the way his grandmother had missed her sister might possibly understand about a carved wall in the cold morning of an alien world. Nothing, he concluded, not yet. The Sci-Fi assessment team broke protocol on the 4th day. They had been given access to all colony facilities, but the protocol agreed by both diplomatic bodies specified that the formal assessment period included structured daily reviews between the human liaison team and the Sci-Fi delegation, scheduled twice per day, to ensure that observations were contextualized and that misunderstandings could be addressed before they were codified. On the morning of the 4th day, the Sci-Fi did not appear for the scheduled review. Holt's liaison team waited 40 minutes. Then Fenn was sent to the Sci-Fi quarters with a polite inquiry. He came back looking like a man who had been shown something he wasn't sure how to report. Valeth wanted an individual meeting with Cale Marin. Not a scheduled review, not a formal assessment interaction, an individual meeting, unrecorded, with no translators except Fenn. She had used a designation in Sci-Fi that Fenn translated with visible uncertainty as something between consultation and reckoning. Holt took Cale aside. You don't have to go. I know. If you go, don't commit to anything. Don't explain yourself in ways that can be formalized. She's going to try to. Rizat, he said it quietly, I know. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression she got when she was doing the calculation between what she wanted to say and what was useful to say and was coming up short. Finally, she just touched his arm again. Same brief, grounding gesture. He went. The Sci-Fi quarters were in the administrative wing, and they had been furnished for the delegation's needs in ways that made the room look half human and half alien. The standard colony furniture arranged geometrically in ways that the colonists wouldn't have arranged it. Sci-Fi equipment and materials stacked or hung on surfaces according to a logic Cale didn't know how to read. Valeth was standing when he entered, which he'd been told was a Sci-Fi posture of deliberate equalization. She could have been seated, which in Sci-Fi hierarchy indicated superiority, but she had chosen to stand, which meant she was treating this as a meeting of something closer to equals, or wanted to appear to. Fenn stood near the wall, trying to be invisible. Cale stood just inside the door and waited. Valeth looked at him with all 4 of her eyes. After a moment she spoke. She says, Fenn translated, that your departure from the memorial site has created a communication problem within her delegation. The assessors disagree on how to classify it. Some believe it was a challenge. Some believe it was a social withdrawal indicating psychological distress. She is asking you directly which it was. Kale said neither. Fen translated. Valith's eyes moved a slight adjustment, a recalibration. She said something. She says, then what was it? He thought about this. He thought about his grandmother's letter, about the careful grief of wanting to put something down in words so it exists somewhere beyond my own head. He thought about Dora Essian pressing the outline of an island into stone. He thought about the lighthouse that turned every 40 seconds, drawing its circle, marking the edge of where they were. There are things, he said, that don't have words, not because they haven't been given words yet, but because words are the wrong instrument for them. When your princess put her hand on our memorial, she was performing a gesture I recognized. I've seen it before. It's the gesture that says, I have evaluated this and it doesn't require further engagement from me. It's a closing gesture, a dismissal. He paused. I've been dismissed by experts. I have been dismissed by people who held my colony's survival in their hands and treated the whole thing as an inconvenience. What I felt when she did that was something that didn't have a response in language. Language would have made it smaller, so I walked away. Fen translated haltingly. Valith was still for a long moment. Then she said something that Fen translated with a slight pause beforehand. She says she doesn't understand what walking away accomplishes if there is no signal content. Kale looked at her. He said, it accomplishes exactly what it accomplished. You're here. Fen translated. The silence in the room was different after that. Kale couldn't have explained how precisely, but he'd lived long enough in a small settlement to know the quality of a silence that has changed, the way a room changes when something that had been potential becomes actual. Valith's secondary manipulators had shifted position. He didn't know what that meant, technically, but he recognized the physical language of recalibration when he saw it, because he'd seen it in humans all his life. She spoke again, and this time the words came slower, which Fen handled with less strain. She says, in Sci-Fi culture, silence is the absence of signal. Departure without address is the end of a transaction. It contains nothing. She has been taught that non-response to a status assertion is a form of submission. She has therefore spent the past day attempting to understand why a colony member whose profile indicates high social standing would submit. She says the mathematics of it have not resolved. Kale said, what did she put in the assessment? A longer exchange. Fen looked slightly pale when he translated. She says she classified the memorial as a collective dependency structure and a cultural vulnerability indicator. She noted that the colony's attachment to non-functional historical objects suggests a population in ongoing psychological displacement, that you have not, in her analysis, fully arrived here. That your identity is still located partially in places and people that no longer exist in accessible form, and that this represents an adaptational deficiency. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Can I show her something? He said. Fen blinked. Yes, I can ask. He asked. Valith considered, then inclined her head in the way the briefings had indicated was affirmative. Kale took the knife off his hip. He held it out handle first, in the open palm way that universally read as non-threat. Valith looked at it. After a moment, she reached out and took it, carefully, examining it with her full visual array, turning it in her long fingers. He said the handle is wrapped in dried sap from a banana tree. The carving was done before the sap hardened. It shows a lighthouse. My great-aunt made this technique. She was living on one continent and writing letters to her sister on another, and she carved that into a knife handle because she wanted to carry something of home with her. He watched Valith's eyes on the knife. I built the lighthouse on Corval Ridge because I inherited the knife. Not consciously. I found out later. but the shape was already in me somewhere, from holding it, from the letters about it, from carrying it for 11 years. He paused. We don't put history outside ourselves because we can't hold it internally. We put it outside ourselves so that it exists in more than one place, so that it can survive us, so that it can travel. Fen translated. Valith looked at the knife for a long time. Her secondary manipulators had retracted completely, which the briefing said was an indicator of he searched his memory, focused receptivity. The posture of someone receiving, not transmitting. She said something. She says, Fen translated, and his voice had changed quality slightly, had lost the diplomatic cushioning and become something more direct. She says that the Sathai have no equivalent practice. She says the Sathai hold their history internally. It is encoded in biological and cognitive structures through their development process, and external representations are considered redundant at best, and at worst, evidence of encoding failure. She says, he paused. She says she is now uncertain whether that is a superior approach or merely a different one. The room was quiet. Valith held the knife a moment longer, then extended it back to Kale with both hands, which was not the way she had taken it. In Sathai body language, he would find out later from Fen, returning an object with both hands was a gesture reserved for things of recognized significance. He took it the same way. He walked back to the greenhouse slowly, taking the long route around the eastern quarter. He passed the memorial wall. The morning light had shifted by now. Ustra's sun was higher, the amber turning toward a clear pale gold that made the shadows shorter and the stone brighter, and in that light the carvings had a different quality than they had in the dawn hour, less haunted, more factual. Names, dates, images, a lighthouse, a banana tree, a fish. Someone had carved a bird that Kale had never been able to identify as any bird from any world he knew, and he had always liked that. The possibility that it was an imagined bird, a bird that existed only in the carving, created for this exact wall, belonging to this exact place. He stood there for a moment, alone, and thought about what had happened in the room with Valith. She had taken the knife with one hand, the natural way, the way you take something offered to you. She had returned it with two. He turned that over carefully. He had noticed it in the moment and filed it, the way he filed most things in the moment, for processing later when the noise was less. Now, in the quiet of the eastern quarter, he processed it. The briefing said the two-handed return was reserved for objects of recognized significance, not objects that were formally valuable, not treaty documents or scientific instruments, objects that were recognized, specifically, as carriers of meaning. The Sathai, who had no equivalent practice to human memorial carving or letter-keeping or lighthouse building, had nonetheless a formal gesture for acknowledging when a thing had been pressed with weight, when it had been used to hold something. She had recognized it, in the knife, in what he had said about the knife. And then she had stood in her quarters, with Fen and Kale and the slight hum of Sathai equipment in the walls, and said, she is now uncertain whether that is a superior approach or merely a different one. A 19-year-old princess of a civilization that had never been required to be uncertain about anything had said, I am uncertain. He pressed the flat of his thumb against the carved lighthouse on the knife handle. The sap was smooth under his thumbnail, polished by years of handling, carrying the warmth of his palm the way any object carries the warmth of the hands that hold it enough. He thought, maybe that's all it takes. Maybe it's not an argument. Maybe it's not a demonstration. Maybe it's just showing someone the thing and letting the thing speak, and then being willing to walk away and give it time to arrive. He went to the greenhouse. The formal assessment continued for 6 more days. Kale returned to his greenhouse, his memorial mornings, his cold teas and evening meals with Pietras. The Sathai assessors continued their documentation. The structured reviews resumed and proceeded with what the liaison staff described as a changed quality, less interrogation, more exchange. On the 7th day, Valith came to the memorial again. She came alone this time, without her assessors, without Finn. Cale was there when she arrived, as he was every morning. He didn't move or speak. She stood beside him at a distance of roughly 2 meters and looked at the wall. He looked at the wall. The amber morning light was doing what it did at this hour, warming the dark stone to something closer to copper. And in that light the carvings were very clear, names and dates, and a lighthouse, and a coastline in hardened sap, and Dora Essian's banana tree with its curving fronds. After a while, Valith reached out, not with her right hand this time, not with the ownership assertion gesture, but with her left secondary manipulator, her smallest appendage, the one meant for fine work, the one that in Sci-Fi culture expressed something that Finn would later translate for Cale as a combination of attention and grief that doesn't fully map to any single human word, and she traced the outline of the banana tree without touching it, a millimeter above the surface, following the carved line through the air. She did not speak. Cale did not speak. He was thinking about what old Pietres had said about certainty, about the person very far back who had been uncertain, who had felt the ground shifting and had learned to hold on. He was thinking about his grandmother writing in the afternoon sun, about a voice that sounded different when it was trying not to laugh. He was thinking about how much these thoughts would mean nothing to a 19-year-old princess of the Sci-Fi, and also how the fact that she was standing here, not speaking, tracing a carved line through the air with her smallest hand, meant that maybe meaning didn't require comprehension to travel. Maybe it just needed to arrive in the body first, the way a song arrives before you know the words, the way grief arrives before you know its name. They stood there for several minutes. Then Valith lowered her hand, and with no particular ceremony, turned and walked back the way she had come. She did not say anything. She just walked away. Cale watched her go. He thought, there it is. He didn't know if she knew she'd done it. He suspected she did. On the 8th day, something happened that no one had planned for. Old Pietres did not go to his meteorological post. He was at the memorial instead, very early, before the amber light had fully come up, standing in front of a section of the wall that Cale didn't know well, a section toward the southern end, where the first-year colonists had carved their pieces before Cale had arrived. Pietres was standing with his hands behind his back, looking at a carving that Cale, when he arrived at his usual time, could see was a small and careful rendering of a house with a distinctive roofline. Gdansk, probably. Or the idea of Gdansk, which was not quite the same thing but was perhaps what Pietres carried. 2 Sci-Fi assessors arrived before Cale had been there 5 minutes. They came without Valith, without Finn, carrying their documentation equipment. They saw Pietres at the wall. They did not set up their equipment. They stood at a respectful distance and observed. Pietres was aware of them. Cale could tell because the old man's posture, already straight, had that particular quality of straightness that is not dignity but the decision to perform it, which was a kind of dignity of its own. He didn't look at the Sci-Fi. He looked at his carving. He breathed in the cold morning air of an alien world, slowly. After a while he reached out with one finger and touched the roofline. He held it there for a moment. Then he put his hand back behind his back. He turned and made his way toward the plaza at his careful shuffle. He nodded to the Sci-Fi assessors as he passed them, the exact nod a man gives to people he has decided he is willing to share a space with. Not warmth exactly, recognition. Cale stood at the wall and watched the assessors. They were very still. One of them had set down her documentation equipment entirely, and her secondary manipulators were extended slightly, in the posture of, he now knew enough to read it, focused receptivity. Valith arrived 20 minutes later. She did not bring anyone. She stood where her assessors had stood, and she looked at the wall in the growing light. Cale was still there, as he always was. She did not acknowledge him in any formal sense, but she moved to stand beside him rather than at the far end, which was, After 11 days of reading Sathai body language through Fenn's translations and his own observation, intentional. He didn't speak, she didn't speak. They stood side by side and looked at the memorial together for some time. The lighthouse beam above them turned its circle, invisible in the daylight now, patient. He thought about the postcard letters. He thought about his gray-tant Philomena writing to his grandmother from Mozambique about the quality of the morning light there, the specific way it was different from Madeiran light, and yet recognizable as morning light, as the light that means the world is beginning again. He thought about how those letters had crossed an ocean for 19 years and then stopped, and how the stopping was itself a kind of record, a record of severance or loss or simply distance that became unbridgeable, and how even that stopping was part of the archive, how silence was itself a form of inscription when it followed speaking. He thought about whether Valeth had anything like that. He thought probably not. He thought probably the Sathai had never needed the letters because they had never been displaced, had never carried their history outside their bodies, had never needed to press the shape of their identity into something external because their identity was always with them, encoded in their biology, inviolable. He thought that must be very safe. And very lonely in a way they might not even have a word for, because you cannot miss what you have never had, and you cannot know the particular warmth of a letter in your hands from someone who knew you before you became what you are, someone who loved the part of you that was formed before the hardening. He did not say any of this. It was not the kind of thing you said to a 19-year-old princess of a civilization currently deciding whether your home would continue to exist. But he stood there beside her in the amber light, and the wall was there, and the names were there, and Dora Essian's banana tree was there, curving out from its stone with the same patience with which the lighthouse turned, and the same stubbornness with which 412 humans had built their lives here in a place where there was no rational reason to build them, and he let all of that be present without explaining it. That was the work, that had always been the work. The final diplomatic report from the Sathai assessment, transmitted to the Deliberative Council 41 days later, 1 day late, which the Sathai Diplomatic Corps noted was unprecedented, and did not explain, classified Marin's reach as a persistent settlement. The specific language used, translated through 3 levels of interpretation, described the colony as an entity engaged in self-locating behavior of a type not previously encountered in this quadrant, wherein identity is maintained and transmitted through deliberate external inscription, creating a durable record that is simultaneously personal and communal in nature. Commandant Holt read the report aloud to the assembled colony, and there was a lot of noise after, the particular noise of people who had been holding something very carefully for a long time and could now briefly put it down. Cale stood at the back. He had a cold tea in his hand. He was thinking about the phrase deliberate external inscription, which was, in its own way, not so different from his grandmother's afternoon sun, and the voice across 1,000 miles, and the words put down so they existed somewhere beyond a single head. The Sathai departed on the 42nd day. Valeth came to the concourse for the farewell assembly, and in the formal exchange of acknowledgments that concluded the visit, she said something through Fenn that he translated with a slight pause before the key word. She says she has updated her personal classification of the colony from, he searched for the right translation, from passage structure to location. She says she understands these are different. Cale said nothing. She looked at him with all 4 eyes. Then the right corner of her face made a small, controlled movement that Fenn would later tell him, with visible surprise, was a Sathai expression used primarily by their elder statespeople. Something in the vicinity of recognition of what cannot be fully known. The Sathai filed back onto their ship. The boarding ramp retracted. The vessel rose in its column of compressed air, bent the scrubgrass flat in its perfect circle, and was gone. The lighthouse turned on the ridge, 40 seconds. Cale stood in the empty plaza with the cold tea in his hand, in the amber morning light, and looked up at where the ship had been, and then at where it wasn't. He turned the knife once in his palm, blade down. He thought about Philomena and her banana tree in Mozambique, and her letter to her sister about the way hardened sap holds whatever shape you press into it before it sets. He thought, we have been pressing shapes into things for as long as we have existed. Into stone, into paper, into the air between speakers, into the minds of people who will carry those shapes forward without knowing they're carrying them, who will build lighthouses because a knife handle told their hands what lighthouses look like, who will stand in silence before things they cannot say, who will walk away from dismissals with their heads up and their mouths shut and wait quietly, with the patience of the long displaced, for the moment when the universe catches up to what they already knew. He finished his cold tea. He went to the greenhouse to check the moisture monitors. The work was there. The work was always there. He checked the first row, root vegetables, deep water irrigation, the temperature-stable section that Marcus liked to say was the closest thing to a guarantee that Marin's reach had. He checked the second row, the grains, the ones that had taken 3 years to adapt to Ustra's soil chemistry, the ones whose first successful harvest had made 2 people cry and 1 person sing a song in a language nobody else at the colony spoke, which was fine, which was exactly the kind of thing that happened. He checked the third row, the herbs and the things that weren't strictly necessary for caloric survival, but that people had asked for because meals without them tasted like survival and not like living, and there was a difference, and the difference mattered. He thought about the Sci-Fi phrase from the assessment report, deliberate external inscription. He thought about the Sci-Fi's confusion about the lighthouse, about the over-engineering, the 12-fold excess relative to functional requirement. He thought, yes, exactly yes. Humanity did not build to requirement. Humanity built to desire. They built the lighthouse 12 times larger than it needed to be because someone felt the pull of that excess, felt the rightness of a thing that said not merely here is navigation, but here is a marker, here is a declaration, here is something that will turn in the dark long after the person who built it is gone, drawing its circle, saying, we were here, we cared, we made something that would outlast us. That was not deficiency, that was the whole point. He thought about Valeth's face when she had traced the carving in the air with her smallest hand. He thought about the assessors at the memorial, standing without their equipment, simply standing. He thought about the Tom Berman Award for Most Promising Filmmaker that the film his Greytance letters had inspired, in some sideways unrepeatable chain of cause and effect, had not received, because awards were not the point of the work and never had been. He thought about the word location, which was what Valeth had upgraded the colony's classification to. Not permanent, not protected. Location. A place that exists in the Sci-Fi's understanding of the map. A place they know is there. It was enough. For now it was enough. There were things Cale had learned to hold that had taken years to hold without dropping them. The death of 22 people he had worked beside and eaten with and argued with and been glad of. The distance from the place he had come from. The uncertainty of every growing season. The knowledge that the decisions being made about the colony's future were being made by people and entities who would never fully understand what they were deciding about, not because they were malicious, but because understanding was not free. It cost time and presence and willingness to stand at a wall in the cold morning without talking. He held all of this in the way he had learned to hold it, which was the way you hold anything you cannot put down, with both hands carefully, without pretending it was light. The Sci-Fi ship had gone, the colony remained. The lighthouse turned on the ridge, 40 seconds. Pietras would be at his meteorological post by now, sitting with his paper journal, reading the instruments and making his notes in a handwriting that had become smaller and more careful as he got older, the way handwriting does when the hands that make it have learned the value of precision. He would write the date at the top of the page, as he always did. He would write the temperature, the wind direction, the pressure reading, the quality of the light. He would write it all down not because it could not be captured digitally, which it could, but because writing it himself was a different act. It was the act of a person in a place attending to that place, pressing the shape of the moment into paper, saying, "This is what this day was, this is what the world felt like from here, this is my record." 412 people doing variations on this every day. 863 diary entries that use the word home. A memorial wall with names and birds and banana trees and islands in hardened sap. A lighthouse no ship needed, turning its unnecessary circle in the dark. He did it the way his people had always done it, carefully, without ceremony, pressing the shape of his presence into a place that was learning to hold him. Behind him the lighthouse turned. 40 seconds. The circle patient and indifferent and permanent and entirely, stubbornly human.